So welcome everyone to the Thursday webinar, CST lockdown webinar series. It's wonderful to be with you. We're at the moment from Cape Town, where it's cold and rainy, and we're happy for the weather to just store up our water supplies that we've had here. Just a little bit to say, this CST webinar is a series we've been doing the past month during lockdown time, and it's been wonderful to have all of you with us and to have these wonderful conversations. We've really had fantastic feedback that people are finding these kinds of sort of more informal conversations between experts and specialist practitioners in the area working with resilience and complexity quite lovely. And thank you also for all the feedback that we've received from all of you. Just to say, today we'll be exploring the idea of building a more resilient future for navigating systemic risks. And we'll focus a little bit about how the COVID crisis could be used as an opportunity for building more resilient futures. And we'll explore what resilience means, how that's sort of understood and translated into the notion of systemic risk, and how that then can be applied in practice. And we have the whole spectrum with us today, from thought leaders to practitioners to governance leaders. So we have Professor Untitled Chapter, who is the co-director at the Center for Complex Systems in Transition in Stellenbosch University, and she also holds the Saatchi Chair in South African Research on Social and Ecological Systems and Resilience. Then we have Kule Chitepo, who's currently the Chemonics International Chair, Chief of Party at the USAID Resilient Waters Project, from where he leads this huge project of sort of river basin groundwater management and also frontier conservation areas. So it's a huge project over a very large geography. And we also have Dr. Dion Nell, who's the CEO of the newly formed Global Resilience Partnership, which is a coalition of more than 50 organizations joining forces to build resilience in the face of shocks, uncertainty and change. And he's also previously Executive Director for Conservation at the WWF. I'm going to briefly ask all our panelists to just introduce themselves and to just ask them where they are and what they're doing at the moment. Wincy, we'll start with you.
It's wonderful to be on the show after listening in for 4 weeks. So thanks, Rika. I think Rika introduced most of my background, but I'm based here in Stellenbosch, at Stellenbosch University, where I'm the co-director for the Center for Complex Systems in Transition, where we really focus on thinking about large transformative change in interconnected social ecological systems, and specifically thinking around transformations towards sustainability. And I also still have a strong link with the Stockholm Resilience Center in Sweden, where I was previously based.
Thanks. Dion, would you like to go?
Dion Nell here, as you will tell from my accent, South African, but based out of Europe now. So with the Global Resilience Partnership based out of the Stockholm Resilience Center, and sitting in Utrecht in the Netherlands at the moment. Lovely to be with all of you. Rika, actually the Global Resilience Partnership has been around for about 4 years, but has evolved during that time. So we're now a partnership of about 55 organizations, previously very focused on innovation challenges and investing on innovation within the resilience sphere, but now more of a partnership that's focused on knowledge brokering and supporting resilience across a partnership of 55 organizations. We're really focused on taking resilience to where it matters the most, so focusing on least developed countries and fragile regions where we believe resilience has a lot to offer, and large impacts in terms of poverty and undernourishment in those areas. We work with our partners in 4 ways. The first is to provide a safe space for innovation. The second is to share and learn and mainstream resilience. The third one is to convene diverse voices to have an impact in policy and investment sphere. And the fourth is advancing knowledge on resilience. So very happy to be with you today. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Kule.
Okay, good morning. Good afternoon, sorry to everybody. Despite the background, I'm not in the Okavango Delta. I wish I was, but I'm in Pretoria. As Rika introduced earlier on, I'm currently the chief of party of the USAID Southern Africa Resilient Waters Program. This is a program that seeks to improve the cooperation of member states, governments, and other institutions and organizations across Southern Africa to better cooperate around issues of natural resources management broadly, but looking more specifically at water resources as well as biodiversity resources. And this initiative is building on some previous investments by USAID Southern Africa that were also testing the approaches towards transboundary management of natural resources. One of them is one of those such investments is the Resilient program, which some of you will be aware of. That program was essentially looking at trying to build resilience in the Limpopo River Basin. And the Resilient Waters Program is actually a reinvestment by USAID Southern Africa in the efforts that were invested in that Resilient program and other regional programs as well, such as the Southern Africa Regional Environment Program and other investments to support Orasecom and other RBOs in the region. So this Resilient Waters Program is a partnership where Chemonics International, which is where I work, is leading a group of consortium partners that collectively are implementing this program. One of them is the Center for Complex Systems in Transition, which ONC represents here. They drive our critical mass of intellectual capital to think through these complexities of resilience, etc. So it's really great to be here and to be part of this series of trying to unpack the complexities that come with resilience. We also work with JG Africa, which is an environmental management firm and working across Southern Africa. We work with Genesis Analytics. They are helping us a lot with the monitoring and evaluation aspects of our work. The Peace Parks Foundation, most of you will know, have been leaders in transfrontier conservation across the region. And then we have another partner in the UK called Oxford Project Management. And our primary beneficiaries are these intergovernmental transboundary institutions that work to manage natural resources. The SADC Groundwater Management Institute is one. The other two from the water sector are the Okavango Commission, as well as LIMCOM, the Limpopo Commission. And then from the biodiversity and broader sector is the TFCAs of CASA, as well as the Great Limpopo TFCA.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Kule. It's amazing to just always once again hear the and also your and Dion's work. I mean, both these are huge projects that are working with organizations on the ground that are, in the front line doing these things. We have been fortunate to work with and are working with both of your institutions, and our learning curve in trying to translate ideas into practice and what it means for people who are actually using these ideas have been huge and enormous, and we've been extremely privileged to have been part of the GRP's work and hopefully continuing on that as well, but also with the Resilient Waters Project. So it's really a kind of a process where we're in this dialogue between what are ideas about resilience and the theories and the thinking, and being able to to go with your organization and to test them and to see, well, is this just navel gazing, or is this actually something that people can use who need it desperately? So thank you for that. And just also quickly to say to our participants, we'll be taking questions at the end of the session. You're welcome to post them in the Q&A box also at the bottom of your screen, and then we can sort of more focusedly look at those, and I will facilitate a question and answer session later in our webinar. So our first question to the presenters is sort of linking onto this idea of how do you use resilience, or the notion of resilience? How do you define it in the context that you are working and using resilience? And what are the kind of practices or capacities that you would identify that we could be using for this notion of resilience building? Wincy, can we start with you?
Sure. yeah, maybe to come in a little bit more from a theoretical side, and then I think it'll be really interesting to hear a bit how some of these concepts are being taken up on the ground, which I think is really where a lot of the challenges lie. And maybe the first thing to say is that I think there are a lot of different understandings of resilience, and I think people are also using it in I think meaning quite a lot of different things, and even in some of the narrower literature linked, for instance, to the Resilience Alliance, the definitions of resilience have also changed over time. So I think it's also an area that there's a lot of conceptual and work going on. But then maybe just to say a few words, and I'll show a few slides on how we at the CST are thinking around resilience, and this links very much to also work at the Stockholm Resilience Center, where we have also strong partnerships. And I'd say the main thing is the way that I think about resilience is really this capacity to deal with change, and it's especially unexpected or novel change. And it's sort of what capacities do you have in your system to be able to respond to the unexpected and also to change into the future. So just to put up a few slides. Is that working?
Yeah.
There we go. Okay. Yeah, so I think also resilience is being used in a lot of different fields. But as I mentioned, we work very specifically in this interface area between big ecological systems and social, political, economic systems, and thinking about them really as complex, intertwined systems. So with that focus and thinking very much around sort of large-scale sustainability issues, but that scale all the way down to the local, we think about social-ecological resilience as this capacity of these interconnected social-ecological systems to sustain human well-being. So it's actually quite a normative definition, focusing on what we want out of it. It's this capacity to sustain human well-being in the face of disturbance and change. And then importantly, it has sort of three different dimensions. So I think often resilience is also thought of just as the ability to kind of bounce back or recover. But I think a lot of the work, and I think a lot of the interesting work, is really about also where does resilience give you the capacity to adapt to changes, and I think even more deeply to actually fundamentally transform your system to deal with maybe really large scale changes. And we'll come to that, I think, later in the talk in respect to the COVID crisis currently. Yeah, so just to re-emphasize that resilience has these three dimensions of being able to persist or recover. And I think that's often when people use it in the context of a storm or a flood or a drought. And it can be, ecological, social ecological. Here's, just mass pollution that the environment is somewhat still living in between that. So that's sort of maybe one way of thinking about resilience. But then I think increasingly we also think about that as the ability to adapt to changes. And we know there are many big changes happening in this era of the Anthropocene. One of the big ones happening in Africa is urbanization. And that is a massive systemic change in terms of where people are living and how they're living, that your bigger society and also your ecosystems need to adapt to. And then I think a lot of the work we're doing at the CST is really focusing in this third area of resilience as the capacity to also innovate and transform. And that sort of much deeper systemic transformations in the ways that we're living or doing things. I think that's also a lot of the discussions going on, for instance, around responding to the climate crisis, where we actually have to fundamentally change the energy sources of our society and our economy to deal with these challenges. So that was sort of more on the definition of resilience, but then just to touch on this idea of kind of capacities for resilience, or we kind of also think about them as general principles for building resilience in systems. And this is at quite an abstract level that there needs to be kind of translated into particular contexts. But actually, for quite a few years, and a few years ago, I led a group with what we called the Resilience Alliance Young Scholars Network. And we wanted to really critically investigate the literature and so what has been put out around kind of underlying ways in which you can build resilience in social ecological systems. And we did a big review And in the end, we actually converted the review into a book. But then we identified these 7 principles. Maybe just to say the first 3 around maintaining diversity and redundancy, managing connectivity, and also managing the slow variables. And I'll maybe say a bit more on that later. Those are kind of applying broadly to both social and ecological systems. So it's sort of the systems that you're governing. You have to pay attention to these dimensions. The foster complex adaptive systems thinking, in a sense, should maybe be, it's in the middle, could be first or last, is sort of the foundation. It's in terms of what's our worldview in terms of how we understand the nature of reality and the way that we need to engage with these systems in order to influence them. And this is also where Rika is actually a big expert and has brought lots of thinking to bear. And then the last 3 around encouraging learning, participation, and promoting polycentric governance systems is really about your governance system and how you're setting up your governance system to manage or govern these social ecological systems. And then I just have one last slide, which is maybe also the direction that we'll spend more of the webinar today, is around thinking around operationalizing resilience. And I think there's a lot of work going on here with lots of different ideas. This is one kind of framework that I found quite useful in terms of trying to draw out the broad things that you maybe need to consider. And I think, they're quite quantitative modeling approaches to thinking about resilience, but I think if you're really trying to build resilience in these bigger governance, social ecological systems, I think they really do require inclusive kind of dialogue with key actors and stakeholders in the system. And I think what this framework points out quite nicely is that, in any situation where you're trying to operationalize resilience, you really need to think about what is the system that you're talking about, recognizing that the whole world and all systems are interconnected, but what's your focus? And then really thinking about to what are you trying to build resilience, what kinds of disturbances and changes. And it can also be kind of novel things, but I think often there's a trade-off. If you're building resilience to one thing, you might actually be reducing resilience to another thing. So it's not always possible to build resilience to everything together. And then I think the really important question is this question of for whom, and that there are often large trade-offs in terms of the kind of system that you're putting in place and who's benefiting or losing by the outcomes of that system. And I think we're seeing that actually very clearly today with the COVID crisis, that there's certain groups and sectors in society that really haven't been benefiting from the current system. And so I think that's really a critical factor to consider, and it would be interesting to spend some time maybe talking about that. And then this issue of timeframes is another important factor. Yeah, so that's just maybe to put some things on the table, maybe more from a theoretical side.
Great, thanks for sharing that, Wincy, and it leads very nicely into, I think, Dion's work and the work that you're doing at the GRP. Would you like to share a little bit on how you would answer that question, Dion? How are you using resilience? What are capacities that you're building, and how are you operationalizing these notions?
Thank you very much, Rika. And Wincy spent a long time at the Stockholm Resilience Center, and we're based there. So in many ways, we're from the same rootstock. So a lot of alignment in our thinking. And rather than come up with something new, perhaps I could just flesh out and emphasize certain things from our perspective. And I guess the first thing I would emphasize is dealing with uncertainty. And you mentioned it in your lead up, Wincy, but it doesn't come across in the definition as strongly as perhaps I would like to see it. And I think, to me, that's what sets resilience apart from adaptation, is dealing with these high levels of uncertainty and unpredictability. And we're seeing significant advances in technologies and abilities to try and reduce that level of uncertainty. But the reality is that we're facing a more volatile world with more compounding shocks. And so we're seeing now, and just to step right into the COVID-19 situation, in East Africa, where they're dealing with a lockdown situation, which is dramatically affecting food systems, but at the same time dealing with a locust outbreak. In India, we are seeing the biggest cyclones coming through in the Bay of Bengal, and now also a locust outbreak in India all on top of a lockdown situation. These are compounding shocks that are very difficult to assess. So to me, this ability to deal with uncertainty is really what sets resilience apart, and certainly drives our thinking and our work to a large degree. The second point I would emphasize is on transformation. Again, I think in many of the geographies that we're working on, persisting or adapting is perhaps buying you time, but it's not actually changing the trajectory that you're on, and that the ultimate end game is always transformation. How do you transform in the face of this uncertainty, these shocks and surprises that you're faced with? So persistence, adaptation are very important, I think, components of resilience, but the end game, at least in the geographies we're working in, should be on transformation. So emphasizing that. Then something which is, Unsi and I have been speaking about this quite a lot, and this is going down to the principles of resilience, and it's the issue of equity and social cohesion, which I think is not. It's perhaps implicit in many of those principles, but certainly in some of the geographies that GRP is working in, and we're working more increasingly in areas that are geopolitically unstable and that are prone to conflict. So working in places like the Sahel, Horn of Africa, and parts of Southern Africa. We're seeing this in parts of Mozambique now. And these areas are areas that are prone to going into protracted crises. And once you're in that protracted crisis, it's very difficult to get out of. And in these settings, it's been shown that equal societies are far less prone to tip into those conflict situations. So there's been good work done on gender equality, showing that societies where there's a higher proportion of women in the workplace are also more stable societies and less prone to tip into conflict. So I think this issue of equality, equity needs to be I think more strongly emphasized in our thinking around resilience. And then also the strength of social networks. Again, and we'll come back to this in the further discussions with COVID-19. That's really emphasized to me is the importance of having these strong social networks, particularly through grassroots organizations, that are able to provide this cohesion across society, but also provide this interlink between society and local government, so community and local government. So that social cohesion at the grassroots level, I think, is also a critical component of resilience. The last thing I would say, again, and it's linked to, I guess, to social cohesion, is this concept of redundancy. And perhaps we think about redundancy as not just being a single point failure. And I think sometimes that's how people think about redundancy, that you don't have a single point failure in the system, but that they have multiple points. And to think about more as a buffering capacity and reserves. So that you're not focused on efficiency where there's limited buffering capacity. And if something fails, you're in trouble. That there is some buffering capacity in the system to absorb higher levels of volatility and uncertainty. But those were some of the comments I would make at this stage. Thanks, Rika.
Thank you very much for that, Dion. Thank you so much for that, for sharing that. Kule, how does this idea of resilience, how is it treated in your project?
Okay, so we also worked a lot with CST and our other consortium partners to put together a conceptual framework to help us to understand the complexities that we are dealing with in terms of delivering a project that has got 4 almost distinct components, and I'll list them. The first one is around natural resources management broadly, and trying to improve the capability of institutions to work across boundaries in managing natural resources. The second component is looking at WASH-related, water and sanitation-related issues. The third component of the program is looking at livelihoods and adaptation. And then the fourth component is looking at biodiversity and ecosystems. So the challenge we were faced with is how do you look at all these four components in an integrated way? And I guess that's the operative word for us in terms of the design of the Resilient Waters Program, is the integration. So I'm just going to share with you our conceptual framework. Okay, can you see that? So, as I said, we had those four components, and we designed a conceptual framework that allows us to place resilience at the center of all the different components and areas within which we are working. I think the schematic there is pretty self-explanatory. We have a lot of work in water on the top left-hand side. We have a lot of work in water sanitation, hygiene, pollution issues, and that really sits at the interface between our water-related work as well as the people and institutions that we need to incorporate. You know, WASH is a very local competence, and it's about providing basic services to local communities. But water also is critical for the health, for ecosystem health. So when you look at the bottom set of bullet points there, the interface between water and biodiversity, that's where you have transboundary management. We've got river basin organizations that are tasked with making sure that they carry out their mandate to ensure that there is enough water, not only for the demands of people and the mining sector and other kinds of industry, but also for the environmental requirements for a healthy ecosystem. So that requires capacity to be able to plan in an integrated way, to manage in an integrated way, and bring on board, which is something we've been wanting to encourage, is bring closer the different sectors that deal with issues of water as well as issues of biodiversity. So you'd find that an example of how we've done this is we've supported the collaboration that is happening between the Okavango Commission and the CASA, Transfrontier Conservation Area, the secretariats, working through their secretariats. They have a joint memorandum of understanding, and we're trying to bring life to that MOU by helping the players which are traditionally separated by sector. Water RBOs are conventionally or traditionally dealing with water issues, primarily issues of infrastructure, water supply, water governance, and the biodiversity, the TFCA crowd are a different crowd, and dealing with biodiversity related issues. But how do you bring these two together? And that's the interface that looks at these kind of interactions there. And then in terms of people and the interaction on the top right-hand corner, the interaction between people and biodiversity, that's where we're dealing with a lot of protected area management, livelihoods issues, etc. And all these three meet in the center, where we are saying that we need to be able to understand the interconnectivity of people, of water, of biodiversity, and develop an intervention that encapsulates all of these moving parts, if you like. And to put another layer of complexity to it is managing the uncertainty and unpredictability that Dion referred to. So from a project point of view, we appreciate that there are a lot of things that are not certain, and a lot of changes that happened that impact on this conceptual framework. They're listed below there. There are changes in climate, changes in population, economy, socio-political changes as well. But it's very difficult from a project perspective to plan for the kind of uncertainty and unpredictability that, as Dion correctly says, is associated with resilience thinking. So we still need to be able to say we are going to, with reasonable amount of certainty, be able to do X, Y, and Z over this period of time. So I think just to acknowledge there that, you know, coming back to the example of COVID, it's been really great that we've had time to reflect with USAID primarily, but also with our other partners that we work with, to look at what is the implication of COVID on our work. And so that ability to within the rigidity that's required of a project framework, to allow for some room to pause and reflect and just say, okay, what does this mean for, you know, the trajectory that we are on? So I think that's one aspect. I think there are other aspects. If you don't mind, Dion, I'll pick up on a couple of what you mentioned and give some examples in relation to our work. So you talked about transformation and transforming the whole way of thinking as an ingredient, as another ingredient or consideration for resilience. Now I'll draw on some of the language that has been used by our partners in CASA. Dr. Nyambe has given he's often described how CASA is not a conservation area as in the definition of the acronym of a TFCA. It is much more an integrated matrix of different land uses, of which conservation is one. It could be a critical one, but there are so many other land uses and factors that affect the landscape of CASA, not least things like settlement. There are wash issues, there are development issues, there's railway infrastructure, transportation, all these other issues that happen in this same space. So there's competition for resources beyond just the kind of conventional thinking of this is just a protected area. So coming back to the issue of transformation, it requires a different way of thinking of how to be resilient, to manage a conservation, a TFC such as CASA. It requires a really transformational way of thinking in order to incorporate all the different moving parts. And again, just bringing it closer to home, so to speak, in terms of the South African context. When we were looking together with the CEO of South African National Parks at the impacts of the COVID pandemic on sandparks and protected areas management, particularly in the context of the Great Limpopo Transfrontier Conservation Area. The CEO used the language of reimagining conservation and protected areas management. And I think that's also very, it speaks to the kind of, thinking that's required in order to be transformative in consideration of resilience. Because you have to reimagine protected areas management under COVID is the management of the labors of protected areas that includes, in the case of the GLTFCA, and particularly around Kruger National Park, but also around Limpopo and Konarezhou, where communities have been so badly affected by the impact on the tourism sector that the protected areas agencies and support organizations like Peace Parks Foundation are finding themselves providing food parcels as part of what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. And, that's not what you would ordinarily think of being part of the business of a protected areas agency. But it requires that reimagining that is critical for the transformation that resilience needs. And then I also would just like to add, by way of ending here, that so we developed a theory of change in terms of the application of this program of resilient waters. And the theory of change has three kind of buckets that are areas of our consideration. The one is looking at the importance of institutions. The other one is looking at the importance of innovation, innovative practices. And then the third one is looking at information management and, dissemination and management of information. So after a lot of consultation and engagement with our stakeholders and our partners, we kind of broke down. So we have this complex conceptual framework that's in the screens, and then we broke that down into what are the three core areas of focus that we need in order to address this complexity. And those are the three areas that, from a program design perspective, that we felt that we needed to look at. And then just to pick up on the issue of, so Dion called it social networks, but we kind of refer to it as, and this is something we learned from the USAID Resilient Program, Resilience in the Limpopo River Basin Program, which is the importance of relationships and partnerships as a key ingredient for building resilience. And I think we've found that a lot of our ability to begin to even think around weathering the storm, even coming back to COVID, the strength that we have to address that is very strongly a function of the good relationships that we've built with our partners, academia, as well as government partners, etc. And we were able to, together with USAID and others, to reflect and chart a way forward in terms of navigating the uncertainty that's there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Kule, for that. And you've also sort of already touched on the second question that we thought we'd try and sort of unpack a little bit in this conversation, and it goes a little bit more into the practical aspects, I think, of resilience. And then I'd like to maybe ask Unsi and David, Dion also to sort of reflect on, which is you've all sort of presented your understandings and ideas of what resilience is at the moment, and how you work with it as a kind of conceptual framing. But in the face of COVID and what we're seeing happening in the world at the moment, do you think that there could be a kind of a change in how we think about resilience? And how does this notion of resilience change, maybe conceptually, but also practically in the work that you're doing, and kind of learnings and things that we are seeing coming out of COVID? Dion and Unsi, would you like to maybe just reflect on that, and also maybe just touch base on what Kule shared?
Should I go first, Unsi? Perfect. Thank you so much. And really interesting contributions from Kule, and I really liked his remark, quoting Fundisile from Sandparks about reimagining the future. I think that's really what's required, and is, I think, fundamental to our response to COVID-19. But maybe to elaborate, Rika, I think in many ways, COVID-19 provides a spotlight on the fragilities of the world that we live in. One which is unsustainable. I would sort of describe it in three terms: unsustainable, unequal, and hyper-connected. So unsustainable, and we know that the outbreak of this disease was linked to zoonotic diseases, which are linked to the way that we're interacting with the natural world, in this case in terms of trade in wild animals, but in many cases zoonotic diseases are linked to also industrial agriculture and expansion of industrial agriculture. So, fundamentally rethinking a more sustainable world. The second is unequal. And similar to climate change and many of these challenges, everybody will be affected, but everybody will be affected differently. And we've seen this in COVID-19, that in some places we've had massive health impacts, but in other places the impacts will be more economic and be more fundamental and broader in terms of the societies that they impact. And quite honestly, I don't think we've seen that unfold yet. So that is still an area that we're uncertain of exactly how that will unfold. But certainly the impacts will be unequal globally. And then hyper-connected, we've seen a crisis in one place spread across 180 different countries in a matter of months due to completely hyper-connected air travel system. We're just traveling way too much as a society, but also hyper-connected across economic systems and social systems. So what started off as a health crisis is spilling over into a food crisis, has affected our financial markets fundamentally. So this is hyper-connected since nature of society is important. So if we go back to some of the fundamental principles that Unsi spoke about, diversity and redundancy. I mean, the places that have more diverse economies and livelihood options are likely to be able to navigate some of these shocks better. So places that have single sectors, dependent on single sectors like tourism or textile factories or resource extraction in Africa, these are the places that are really struggling to navigate. Places where governments have high levels of sovereign debt and just don't have room to maneuver are also going to struggle a lot. Talking about this connectivity, we're seeing that the International Labour Organization tells us that 1.6 billion informal workers are being hit with about 80% reduction in wages globally. So that's a massive impact that is influencing our systems. Dramatic impacts on food security. Many of you will know that in South Africa, struggling with food security issues. So managing connectivity becomes critical. The third component is inclusive governance. We've seen that in places where there is strong grassroots federations, grassroots organizations with strong links, but with the local governments, they've been able to self-organize those communities. They've been able to assess the vulnerability of those communities, coordinate and direct resources where they needed them most. So this inclusive governance becomes critically important. The other point I just touched on there is information. In a situation such as COVID-19, there's a lot of information floating around, and you need trusted sources of information. And so these grassroots organizations become knowledge brokers in terms of providing trusted sources of information that allow coordinated responses. So critical role that they play in terms of resources, directing resources and information. So I think if we look forward, what are the type of sort of post-COVID investment packages that we're looking for? Back to Kule's point, this has to be beyond recovery. It has to be about reimagining and reshaping a more resilient future. And interestingly, we're seeing these words coming out of leaders like Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, the President of the European Union, President of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, all talking about a more resilient future, but it means different things to different people. I think it really means resetting our relationship between humans and environment. I think that's the fundamental basis of what we're dealing with here. It means about managing the connectivity in the system, so reducing our reliance on over-concentrated systems, food systems, finance systems, energy systems, moving towards diversification and appropriate localization of food systems, as well as energy systems, looking towards more decentralized, diversified energy systems. Promoting equity and inclusive governance is going to be critical in building a more resilient future. And rethinking and reimagining the role of these grassroots organizations that provide this vital link with the impacts, where the impacts are felt the most. So those are some of the ingredients, I think, Rika, that we're learning about and that we think we should be encouraging as we go forward and thinking about a more resilient future and reimagining that resilient future, as Kule mentions.
Thanks, Dion. Unsi, do you have a response to that?
Of course. But I think it's also a super interesting discussion, and I think maybe also to kind of go back, zooming out a little bit, I mean, in terms of sort of thinking about sort of what this is telling us about the theory. I think it's always kind of really interesting when you have a crisis or a real big event, and it kind of throws light on, I think, very specific aspects of the system or of dynamics in the system that can also then help you further understand and develop our thinking and theories. And for me, I mean, two of the ones that have, I think, really stood out in terms of thinking about this complex adaptive social ecological systems and resilience thinking is firstly is this idea that that the loss of resilience in kind of more stable times is often goes unnoticed. So I think during more stable times, there's a tendency to try to increase efficiency, and as Dion said, chop out some of the redundancies and buffers. And that kind of goes unnoticed until some kind of catastrophe or big crisis hits. And I think that's very much what we're seeing now. And I think especially in terms of healthcare and how that's been eroded even in many quite well-off countries, and also around food security, job security, I think many aspects of our system, and those are being really highlighted now. And I think that's really interesting. And it also made me think that I think in many of these complex systems, you have a crisis sort of starting in one sector, but often the knock-on consequences and the kind of larger systemic effects actually are much bigger, and sometimes the real crisis ends up being somewhere completely else in the system. And I think we see that often also with technological change, that it starts at this technical level, but then it can actually completely remake society. And we've seen that, you know, with things like the introduction of the telegraph, aeroplanes, they actually completely restructure the world. And I think it would be interesting later to look back on this COVID crisis. We sort of started as a health crisis, but it's clearly having massive other effects. And those effects, I think specifically maybe around the economy and how we structure economy, might in the end be the bigger effects that are more lasting. And that maybe brings me also to, I think, another key aspect, which I think is coming up in lots of the conversations here, that I think is also very much emphasized in resilience thinking, is that crises really are often big opportunities for change. And that it's often in those moments that the system is kind of a little bit loosened up. There's a bit of a shift in the power dynamics and the balance of powers and vested interests. But then that it's often kind of ideas that are lying around that have been developed often for long periods of time before the crisis that can then kind of be put in place. And so I think it's also sort of drawing on that, thinking about how we've seen transformation and transformative change happen in the past, and how can we leverage some of what is happening now to maybe think, how do we actually restructure some key dynamics in these systems to put us on more positive kind of trajectories of development that are more equitable. And maybe just to end off, I'm kind of going into the third question, Rika, so but is to also think about kind of the future. And I also wanted to just mention, I think, another project that probably many of the listeners have heard about, that we've also been engaged in the past few years, is sort of a network of initiatives around the world called the Seeds of Good Anthropocenes. It's really been looking at these kind of bottom-up marginal initiatives that are often driven by kind of activists and entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs at the grassroots level. They're trying to pioneer new ways of doing things. And I think one of the, for me, really interesting things in the COVID crisis has been the extent to which I think some of these initiatives that have been very kind of marginalized and small have actually really stepped up. And they've been some of the big initiatives that have, you know, actually had the capacity to come in and leverage their networks, provide food parcels, and do all kinds of things in the communities. So I think it's also interesting to think, and yeah, we had a talk earlier this week about how many of these organizations have stepped in, but how do we also think about the bigger systemic, larger scale structures that are needed to make some of those initiatives sustainable and longer term, so that they don't just vanish when this acute crisis goes away. And I think that is really interesting. And maybe just to end off with, Bjorn, you were mentioning this point about the sort of this changing relationship between humans and nature, which I totally also support, that there is a very fundamental change there. That's also about how we think about our place in the world as humans. But I think the other part that's sort of very, I think, closely connected to that, that's also been highlighted in the SEEDS project, is also rethinking the connection and relationships between humans, and how do we relate to each other, and how do we see each other. And I think some of that, in a sense, has really, I think, in a very positive way, come out in this crisis, is, just people's humanity and connecting to other people as people. And that's maybe also something that, within the kind of, market-driven system we've been living in, some of that maybe has also got lost. And so, those are some positive things, but I think also huge challenges in terms of the bigger structures that we're embedded in, and how do we use this crisis to maybe try and redirect some of those big forces and dynamics.
Great, thanks, Unzi. I think what we're going to do is, I see there's many questions coming into the box, and Kule, you've sort of already touched on that question of how does the notion of resilience change in the crisis. You were talking about sharing food parcels and other kinds of networks that have been activated. That isn't sort of specifically, kind of project level things that's in the Resilient Waters project, but maybe. What I would like to maybe do now is to maybe just look at the questions, because there are quite some interesting questions coming out, and a few of them are directed to Kule and Dion. So I'd like to maybe just use the time that's left for us to look at these questions, if you don't mind. And then also, I think many of these questions will be a kind of a response, or they link quite nicely to what both of you have been saying and what Kule has been saying earlier. So I'm just going to read one of the questions that's been coming up higher. So people are voting on the questions and weighing them. So the one at the moment at the top is one that says that many of the emergency responses we are working on linked to the pandemic and other shocks are plasters and coping mechanisms, and quite possibly reinforcing many negative feedback loops, like importing cheap pre-packed food, or increasing plastic products and those kinds of things, and they have cascading economic impacts. How can we both respond to crises as they emerge and still work also on the broader structural issues that need to be transformed with limited resources? That seems like a kind of $1 million holy grail question, but I think it's interesting. Kule, do you have any learnings or any kind of experiences or any kind of insights to share and to answer that question with? What are...
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. The nice thing about this was going to be one of my comments on the last question that you had, but one of the nice things about being in a crisis like this is, because of the unknowns, it's okay to say, I don't know. So in our kind of work, it's not often that you're allowed to just say, I actually don't have the exact answer for this. But I think it is definitely a concern. We're learning so much of these negative feedbacks, and I think it's happening not only from an environmental perspective, but also from a social perspective. We've seen how lockdowns are having, just coming back to your point, Unzi, about the humanity, and looking at the social impacts of people having to live in different kind of confined spaces, and some of the social ills that we've seen a proliferation on, in terms of gender-based violence, for example, in some of the homes. It's a complex one, but these are, I think, the best answer I can give is that the best way we're going to learn is by being open to hearing and listening and seeing what is happening in this unknown situation. We're all in uncharted waters here to a large extent, and we're learning so much from all the negative as well as positive implications. I think those of us who are parents are respecting teachers a lot more, because now we are understanding about some of those challenges there. And Dion talked about maybe that we are traveling too much in terms of the work that we do. That's another complex it's another complex area, because the same way that we used to conduct business of having workshops and conferences, etc., by stopping doing so has had a huge negative effect on those economies, on those subsectors of the economy. So it's one thing to say, oh, it's great, we're not having to travel as much, but then you're having the impact of not just the leisure tourism, but also the business tourism, which in many parts of our region is a huge part of the economy, sustains a lot of livelihoods. We've got economies that are struggling. You mentioned, Dion, about having sovereign debt, and it gives you a lot more options. But a lot of the economies in our region don't have a lot of options economically. So it's not as straightforward as to say that traveling less is going to be better for the environment, because at the same time that means a whole huge chain of our economy is adversely affected, from airlines to hotels and lodges and travel industry. So I think all I can say is that it is very complex, and I think that from a project perspective, we try and listen and work with partners like CST and others who provide these kind of platforms that allow us to reflect and think, what does this mean? How can we do that better? How can we prepare for some of these things in the future?
Great. So thanks for sharing that on a very human level, Kule. I really appreciate that. Yeah, and bringing that to the fore once again. We have about 2 minutes left, and the questions are just coming in and in. I just want to say that we'll be sharing these questions, and we can save them and actually, share them to all the panelists, and we can maybe find another way to respond to them as well, and that would be quite interesting and creative. But we will also be we're also launching what we call a Resilience Hub website, and that will be launched later in June, which is part of our work with Resilient Waters Project and other partners, where we will be answering many of your questions that I'm seeing in the box. And I think what the questions in the box are about what are practical methods for understanding or evaluating whether one thing is more resilient than another. How do you choose when is one thing more resilient than another, and what are the methods for promoting or fostering sort of integration and looking at how we can manage change and uncertainty, and how those sort of practical things can help us come up with new solutions. Also, what is the role of the sort of private sector in all of this? So it looks at the loads of questions that are coming in is really to try and answer the practical questions of, so how do we decide, where do we put the money, where do we engage, where do we decide what is good, what is bad? And I think those have been the field or the topics in which resilience research and practice and assessments, evaluations have been working quite a lot, and there's a huge need, as it seems, for those ideas and practical solutions to come to the fore. We want to stop at 2:00 sharp, so I'm going to maybe just end with the last question to Dion, but maybe all of us can just reflect on that and say one word or one sentence after Dion has 30 seconds to answer the question. Given the current pandemic and related emphasis on disparity in the third world, is the Stockholm Resilience Centre or the Global Resilience Partnership looking at methodologies for promoting future resilience and understanding the complexities? Are there some practical, new, innovative things, Dion, that you guys are looking at that you could maybe just share some pilot ideas on going forward? What are interesting new ideas that you're working on? Sorry, just unmute. I'm trying to unmute. There you go. Just repeat that, Dion.
But absolutely, I think we have a strong emphasis on innovation, and so the short answer is that we don't have the solutions, but we need to learn innovate and learn very quickly. Areas that we are seeing a lot of promise in terms of innovation include issues like nature-based solutions. So we think there's a lot of innovation that provides more systemic resilience. We think in issues around equity, women's empowerment, there again, a very systemic intervention which builds resilience at a very systemic level. On the sort of positive future-oriented technological solutions, so looking at a lot of communication solutions that are now becoming more affordable for vulnerable communities, and using those solutions to see how they can build a better social cohesion and respond in the face of these types of crises. And then final one, which again is showing a lot of promise for us, is social inclusion. Sorry, let me say that again. Financial inclusion. So financial inclusion, allowing more people to have access to financial systems, women's saving schemes at a grassroots level that allows people to access credit and to be able to invest in their futures. These are some of the areas that we're doing a lot of innovation in, and I think hold a lot of promise. But as I say, big question for a short time, Rika.
Yeah, that's true. Any last words from Kule or Unsi, just to say goodbye, or just to last thoughts?
I'll give over to Unsi. She has
No, just to say thanks so much for this, I think, very stimulating and interesting conversation. And yeah, maybe just to end off with going back to the question from the audience that Rika posed. I mean, I do think that is the real kind of art and the challenge and the dance, in a sense, that needs to be navigated now, which is, the immediate crisis and responding to that, and at the same time, keeping in view this long term. So how are we responding in ways that is also helping to shift the system? So you can't only focus on the long term, but you can, I think, also just focusing on the short term is most likely, or very, I think it has a real danger of just basically putting us back into the old system. And in many parts of the world, that's clearly not where we want to be. So I think that is a real challenge. And I mean, I think that really comes to sort of, in a sense, the heart of complexity and uncertainty, and how do we navigate into this unknown. And I think, also kind of go back to some of Rika's work with Pulsal ES, also, in a sense, really having to place a lot of trust in kind of leaders at all levels, but human beings acting on their best judgment based on the information they know, and connecting with each other, in a sense, to kind of try to navigate the system. But I think it's really at all these interlinked, complex scales where action needs to take place. And we are definitely going to have errors because it is the unknown, but it is about sort of finding this pathway into the future. And I think it is going to be very exciting over the coming weeks, months, and years to look back on this crisis and try to understand what's happened, and where the opportunity was well used, and where maybe we can learn to do things better in the future.
Great. We'll stop there. So thank you very much for everyone that asked questions and for your time and participation. Thank you to our panelists for your time and for sharing your expertise and insights. And it's really wonderful to see you together and have you together in one conversation. And thank you so much for engaging in this way. We'll be posting a recording of this talk on our website, so that will be available as from Monday. And we hope to see everyone next week. We will have another interesting discussion, and the invitations will go out as soon as Monday as well for that. So thank you very much, everyone. And it was lovely seeing you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Rika. Thanks. Cheers, everyone.